podcast that we've been waiting to tell for about 10 years now. Tales from 2010, Viking season like no other. Joining me is Judd Zulgad, who was with me in the trenches on the beat that season, our producer Declan Goff. The first episode, of course, we went through all of the drama surrounding Brett Favre, the will he or won't he, once they kidnapped him in Hattiesburg and brought him back, how quickly things went into a downward spiral, not only on the field with his various injuries and inability to kickstart the Vikings offense, but of course off the field with his scandal and sort of the sad demise that led to him basically being crushed into the frozen TCF Bank Stadium turf to end a 20-year storied career with a concussion. But now we move on to the other great personnel debacle, demarcation in franchise history, if it were, the reacquisition of all-time great disruptor and pass catcher and game breaker Randy Moss, and the quick demise, that acquisition, how quickly that fell apart, and also the ramifications for signing him, what led to the signing, and also what led to his departure and how his departure planted the seeds for Brad Childress's firing, and how that may ultimately should it hang over Randy Moss's legacy, both in Minnesota and as an NFL receiver. So we're calling this episode, Pull Your 84 Jerseys Out and Then Put Them Right Back In. Judd?
That's very, very fair. Yep. As much excitement as I've seen about probably the return of a player / non-game actually in this town, Murph. And as soon as that excitement started, the balloon basically got popped. It was just very, very fitting for 2010 that the Randy Moss situation that we're about to go through unfolded like it did, I'd say.
So to set it up, if folks do remember, the Vikings started out 0-2 that season despite getting Favre back. They lost on the road to Super Bowl champ New Orleans, sort of, Buckner walking back into Shea almost a little bit for those Founders fans. It was the Vikings going back into the Superdome so quickly after that NFC Championship game loss. Didn't get it together offensively, looked even worse in their home opener week 2 against the Miami Dolphins. Suddenly they're 0-2, and Sidney Rice, who was injured in that NFC Championship game, decides to put off surgery on a hip throughout the offseason, didn't participate in offseason activities, comes to training camp and is on the reserve list. And it becomes pretty clear early in the fall that he may not be back, certainly not in the first half of the season. And if not, he's not going to be able to make an impact. Would he be the same receiver? And see, Harvin was also having migraine issues at this point. The Vikings really didn't have any kind of receiving threat for the soon to be 41-year-old Brett Favre to even have options downfield. Was this a panic move to go out and trade for Randy Moss, or was it a move of necessity that in retrospect they had to make?
Well, I'd say the trade for Moss, Murph, in and of itself was a panic move, and here's why. So the Vikings knew going into training camp that that he should have had surgery. He elected not to. And I think the Vikings had a feeling that this might be bad and that he might be set back quite a bit, which indeed proved to be the case. So they started to shop around, especially I'm sure when Favre came back, for a veteran receiver who Favre could work with to take the place of Sidney Rice. And the most important thing is they actually got a deal done. Vincent Jackson of the San Diego Chargers that season was in a contract dispute, and he was holding out from the Chargers. And A.J. Smith, the GM then of the Chargers, and Rick Spielman and the Vikings reached an agreement on a trade, on compensation. And I believe the Vikings also had reached an agreement on a potential contract with Jackson for him to come here, sign, and then start playing. And if that trade goes through, Moss does not become an option here. And, the whole thing with Randy and pull out your 84 jerseys, that press conference never happens. Now, the important thing, and where, again, 2010, just at every turn, if you're the Vikings went sideways, was my understanding, Murph, of what happened was at the 11th hour, A.J. Smith basically said, you know what? screw Vincent Jackson. I'm going to squat on his rights. I'm not going to trade him, not because I don't like the Vikings deal, because I think the agreement was in place, but because I'm not going to be bullied into trading a player who does not want to play for my team. And so my understanding at that point in time was the Vincent Jackson trade was pulled off the table, and the Vikings were then, and Spielman especially, was left to scurry for the solution, knowing still that Sidney Rice was not coming back at a point soon. And what I don't know is, I don't know if Spielman made the call to Belichick and the Patriots, if the Patriots were just shopping Moss, who I believe was trying to get a new contract at that time. And the Patriots basically said, you know what, he's played well, but he's declining. We're not going to pay him. But long story short, the Vikings, I believe, next turn was to the Patriots, and that's where the Moss deal, the ball started to roll on that after Jackson became a player that the Chargers were going to trade and then decided they weren't going to trade him.
So what happens is the Vikings they end up beating the Lions at home. Imagine that, to stop the bleeding. They go into their early bye at 1-2. So during the bye, word leaks out of it didn't really leak out. It came gushing out of New England. You're right. Randy Moss had been upset that he wasn't getting a contract extension from the Patriots. He ends up having the first of a couple of monumental press conferences that season where he says after a Monday night, I don't know if it was a loss or a win to the Dolphins, but basically said, I don't think they want me here anymore. I'm not sure I want to be here anymore. And that didn't take long for Bill Belichick to realize, you know what? We're going to biopsy this. We're going to get rid of the cancer and we're going to move on. And lo and behold, they found themselves some huckleberries over in the land of 10,000 desperations. The Vikings needed a downfield threat. I don't know who reached out to who. I don't know whose ears perked up more, Belichick at the thought of offloading a disgruntled, declining receiver who made it clear he didn't want to be here, or the Vikings who, hey, if we can't get Vincent Jackson, hey, we'll get Randy Moss. Not only will it be a great solution to our football problems, but from a marketing standpoint, you can't help but see where that's going to lead for the Vikings. Bring back number 84. He never should have left. He's going to ride in kind of like Favre did on the plane from Hattiesburg. He's going to come in from Foxborough, and of course that first press conference where, again, he's all smiles, all giggles. Don't worry about the past. Be thankful I wasn't on that boat. Ha, ha, ha. Everybody's having a good time. Hey, maybe this is a new Randy, a breath of fresh air, but it didn't take long for things to spiral out of control.
So the important thing, too, I think, that led to the trade itself and the press conference that you're talking about, Murph, two things. One is, if you recall, a few years before that, and around the time that Moss went to the Patriots, Favre basically was openly, I believe, politicking in Green Bay at that time for Moss to join the Packers. And the Packers and Ted being Ted, said no. So he didn't go there. But there was an infatuation at that point, I think, with Favre himself and fans as well about what would a Favre to Moss combo look like. The other thing that I believe unfolded behind the scenes at this point, because keep in mind, Spielman was a powerful executive with the Vikings at that point, but this is before he became GM. And Childress, in fact, I believe it was during a conference call, it might have been with Lions reporters in 2010 at some point in time, pointed out that he had control of the roster. So Brad basically was de facto GM, and Rick did Brad's work for him. And my understanding behind the scenes around the time that the Moss trade was about to be made was Rick did go to Brad, Spielman did, and said, I can get Moss. Can you handle him? Which was a very fair question, because in retrospect, the answer was absolutely not. But I think the Vikings were panicked. They were struggling. And I think the feeling was Brett Favre and Moss would form this, potentially unstoppable duo. And so Brad said, yes, it's not going to be a problem if Moss comes here. So I believe that Brad was given a chance to say, okay, that's no. But instead said yes. And that then gets us to the presser where, as you said, Moss comes back And that presser, Murph, sticks with me to this day because of its, I think it might be the most frenetic paced press conference I've ever covered. Moss was basically controlling it. I believe it was an NFL Network reporter started to ask a question, and she was just sort of thinking her way through her question. Absolutely fair, right? And trying to be thoughtful. Halfway through, Moss basically cuts her off and says, okay, no, not you, now you. It was of Trumponian-like presser sorts, just in this bizarre fashion that he was going to conduct it. And I'll never forget the last point that you brought up to me is the point at which I said, this is going to be a unmitigated disaster. Moss gets done and he's still there and he's, he's yucking it up and it's all fun and games. And Ziggy Wolf was in the back of the press conference in the shed there, the practice shed. And he's watching it. And, in typical fashion, he's absolutely thrilled, right? They got Randy Moss back and he's thinking to himself, ticket sales and jersey sales. And Moss's last words, as I recall, into the microphone that day were, y'all lucky I wasn't on that boat. And keep in mind, so Moss was gone by the time that the Love Boat cruise happened. But keep in mind, up until then, that had come in the first year that the Wilfs owned the team. And it had been among the biggest blemishes and embarrassments. Like, I think the Wilfs thought, we are buying the New York Giants. And instead you get, what's the equivalent at that time in 2005 of the Three Stooges, right?
Yeah, a pontoon full of felons.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll never forget, I looked back when Randy said that. And Ziggy is laughing uproariously how funny this comment about the boat was. And I thought to myself, you've got nobody in this building that can handle this guy. And 5 years before, you would have traded him for saying that. And that was the first time I thought, there's no control here. Like, this is, you have basically put the train on the tracks and you have no way to stop it. And not even up to Ziggy or Brad Childress can anybody contain this guy.
Well, and it should be noted, too, in the chronology of all this, as I had gone back and read the clips, it was a couple of weeks later, before they decided to cut him, before Childress did decide to cut him, there were some reports out of New England, and on some of the pregame network pregame shows, I believe Charlie Casserly was the one who broke this, that said the reason, one of the reasons the Patriots got rid of Moss is that he and Tom Brady got into a wrestling match, a shoving match that turned into a wrestling match in the Patriots locker room because Brady had challenged him in his work ethic and made some reference to whatever beard that Moss had at the time, said, hey, why don't you clean yourself up? And this was during the time when Brady had his floppy, he was just starting to date Giselle, I believe, and was getting his escaping going. And he had his flop top going.
Yeah.
So Moss said something back to him along the lines, why don't you cut your hair? You look like a girl. And then the next thing you know, they're wrestling around on the floor. So a sixth grade argument is what precipitated Moss's exit from New England. So the fact that he comes in all smiling, like, you know what, I'm going to come in here and I'm either going to kick ass or I'm going to burn this place down on the way out. Well, he pretty much lit a match pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah. And he was... I think the thing that the Vikings didn't know, and I think the thing that Belichick and the Patriots probably had caught onto was when Randy being Randy skill-wise on the field went, Murph, it went. Because the guy that we saw here was a shell of the guy that had thrilled fans from 98 to 2004. And so the guy that we saw for a month here certainly could still play. I'm not saying he couldn't play, but the baggage was way too much. Like, he needed to dial it back a ton. And I think he actually increased it. And he increased it in part because he and Favre had zero checks and balances. I was told that at some point in time in the offensive meetings that Favre and Moss would essentially sit there as the game plan was being discussed or installed or talked about and would just laugh because they thought it was just stupid. And they were probably right, but that's still a problem. And then he infected Percy. This was, I think it's safe to say that in the course, Brian, of both our careers, we will never see a player again behind the scenes do as much damage on and off a field or court or ice as Moss did in such a short period of time.
In a short period of time. And it
yeah,
was
1 month.
It was a move made 28 days.
Yeah.
Not to belittle rehab, but I mean, there's probably a reason 28 days has an impact as far as people trying to clean themselves up. In 28 days, Randy Moss took this franchise on a ride that it hasn't really experienced since, in terms of two veteran players and a coach that ended up losing control of those veteran players and ultimately losing his job. Declan, I wanted to ask you, where exactly were you in 2010, and what did it mean to you to hear that Randy Moss was coming back to Minnesota?
So in 2010, in October of 20, I was a senior in high school. So I am living out my
glory
days.
Years, the glory years.
Yeah, the glory years. I mean, seriously, this was peak. This is peaking in life, right? Everyone says they peak in high school. I did not. However, senior year in high school, very formidable memories. And I mean, I had been a Vikings fan. Like, my earliest Vikings memory is, unfortunately, the 2000 season, which was 41 Donut. So that's the first season I truly remember just from my youth, which is a great starting point, right? However, through the years, there's the 04 and the Nate Poole game. But by like 2007, 2008, and then into 09, now I'm a high schooler and I have more fonder memories, and I can gravitate towards games more. So now I'm all in on being a Vikings fan, right? Now I'm all in on being tortured for the foreseeable future. And in 09 was such a fun, magical year. Getting Favre, is he going to come? Is he not going to come here? And then for them to lose them the way they did in the NFC Championship game, that one probably stung more than obviously 41 Donut, and even 2017 with Case Keenum, just because of how truly close it was to happening. I mean, they were on the doorstep of going to a Super Bowl. And when they lost, I remember I was watching it at my neighbor's, and then I walked home and I didn't even say a word. My mom asked, I remember did they win? Because she wasn't watching the game. And I didn't say a word. And I went upstairs, I took a shower, and I went to bed. I didn't say a single word to her because I was so heartbroken over the loss. So to bring it full circle into 2010, obviously I'm all aboard. They're going to run it back. What could go wrong? Seriously, what could go wrong? Even they go 0-2, and I'm still thinking, it's 0-2. It's week 2 of the season. I'm not worried about this. This should be fine. They get a easy, lousy win against the Lions. They're going to the bye. All right, this will be okay. And then I'm getting out of school one day, and I can't remember if this was a Friday or not. I feel like it was a Friday because of how exciting it was. But the Twins were about to start game 1 of the ALDS, and we're in the parking lot. We're actually in the Dunning parking lot. I went to St. Paul Central, so I was in a rec center parking lot, which was right next to my high school, where we all parked our cars. And this was the day and age where smartphones weren't totally around yet, but they were slowly getting around. But some friends started like freaking out, going, oh my God, did you see the news? And I'm thinking, like, what the hell happened? And they're like, the Vikings got Randy Moss. And I couldn't believe it. And for the next 10, 15 minutes in the parking lot, we're all glued to our phones trying to get on the crappiest of internet to confirm if Randy Moss is coming back to the Vikings. I mean, this was an insane moment. And for him to finally come here, and the excitement that was after, going to the bye with a stronger win and the season's going to get turned around, I was all in. I was looking for Randy Moss jerseys. I thought this was going to be the best thing ever. And it turned out to be one of the most disastrous and roller coaster months of my life, with both the Vikings and the Twins getting swept in the ALDS. It was homecoming time around senior year of high school, so there's a lot of emotions there. I strongly believe that October of 2010 is still one of the craziest months of my life, and I'm now 28, and it's been 10 years since then.
I recall how that story broke. The best part about it is that story broke. So Bill Simmons got a tip that trade was going to be made, that Moss was going from the Patriots, his hometown team, basically, to the Vikings, Murph. And to Declan's point, it's 2010. So Simmons, who worked at ESPN at the time, trying to be a good employee, was going to tip off Schefter and say, hey, this trade is going down, make some phone calls. But because it's 2010, he tried to, I believe, DM him on Twitter and accidentally tweeted it out to everybody. And then I believe officially the story was broken by Jay Glazer, because I was in Britt's pub and I saw a crawl saying Randy Moss and
in the afternoon, Judd?
I had no clue. No, it was like 5 p.m. I recall it being happy hour. I was in Britt's and the crawl, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to go home. But 2010 technology, Simmons thought he was DMing Schefter and accidentally tweeted out for the world to see. So the what was supposed to be a private message to Schefter was basically tweeted out.
That's a very 2010 story. No question.
Because that probably doesn't happen now, right? Like now the technologies probably sound where you wouldn't accidentally DM and put it out for the world on Twitter to find out.
No, that story would have been easily backdoored. Schefter would have broken it. It would have been the trickle down as we all usually see, or maybe Glazer as well. But those guys are still, the NFL's a rigged game. Let's put it that way. News breaks, flows downhill. So
that's how it works.
It's funny you bring up the timeline, Declan, because in looking this up, you weren't wrong. It wasn't a Friday. You were wrong. It was a Wednesday, I think, when the story broke. His press conference was Thursday. They played Monday night in the Meadowlands. Wednesday,
they were off on Wednesday. That's right.
Game one was you're right. It broke on the off day. Game one of the ALDS Twins Yankees first playoff game at Target Field was Wednesday night. Thursday night they fell down 2-0, flew to New York, and were basically eliminated Saturday night. Everybody that was in town covering that ended up going over to the Meadowlands on Monday to cover those stories as well. That's why I remember that too. It was a very compressed time period, but a lot of headlines going on at that point. So yes, as we mentioned, Moss makes his debut on Monday night. So much going on, not only in the Twin Cities, but just around the Vikings. Again, Moss is acquired. They have his reintroductory press conference on Thursday. Get your 84 jerseys out. Twins are, and either that day or I believe it was Friday, Deadspin breaks the Brett Favre sexting photos and messages and voicemails to Jen Sturger. That is all hanging over the team's head as they go, by the way, to the Meadowlands to play the Jets on Monday Night Football. Favre throws his 500th career touchdown pass to Randy Moss in the third quarter, starting a comeback that didn't quite make it. Favre ends up getting elbow tendonitis. Moss is in the locker room. I remember approaching him for an interview at about 1:30 in the morning, just saying, "Hey, Randy, you got a few minutes to talk." And he all of a sudden was like, "I ain't talking today. I ain't talking at all." Like, really? You're not going to talk? He goes, "You got a problem with that?" I go, "Well, I do, but so do all the fans in Minnesota." He says, "I'm not talking." Well, he eventually did talk later after Brett Favre's infamous bowels of Meadowlands Stadium tabloid journalism. Why are you sending pictures of your nether regions to Jen Sturger news conference? Randy Moss did eventually open up. However, he did not talk again to the Minnesota media, which of course leads to another story at the end of the month in Foxborough, another monumental genre-breaking press conference. But until that time, the Vikings eventually beat Dallas at home. They go to Green Bay. They were kind of mistake-prone. They didn't play very well, but Moss isn't a factor much at all. And this is leading up to, on Halloween, the return of Randy Moss to Foxborough, Judd. And what do you remember about that?
Well, actually, to go back to the games before that too, Murph, that Cowboys game was supposed to be a huge deal because it was Moss's first game at the Metrodome after the trade. It was the Cowboys who had, passed up on Moss when Jerry Jones had told him back in 98 that he was going to draft him. And so everyone was excited. And then you lose the game that you're talking about to the Jets. And now it's like, bubble has been burst. And I remember that game against Dallas feeling like before the Jets lost that the buildup to that game was going to be enormous. And then it was big, but it was not as big as we expected. And then just quickly, do you recall the game in Green Bay? So this is where as a player, you knew that Moss was a shell of the guy who had been a star here. There was a Favre pass to the back of the end zone. I think it was in the second half, but I'm not sure, of that game in Green Bay for Moss, and he alligator armed it.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, you can't afford to do that. And I think it disappointed Favre. It more importantly showed Moss could know by that point in his career where Belichick and the Patriots had been right. He could no longer get by on his name and that talent. Like, he had to work, and he wasn't going to work. And he certainly was not going to get drilled in the back of the end zone on a Favre pass. And so I remember that play in particular as being the now you know why he got traded moment, which was the Patriots said, you don't have the talent to justify the attitude. And then, yes, we then get to the last game. So he goes back to play the Patriots. And so this is going to be, by this point in time, I feel like the year is really slipped away. Like, by this point, it felt really, really wrong. It didn't feel. I did not predict the dome collapsing, to be clear. I just felt like the team was not going to be nearly as good as we thought. And to Dex's point, this team that we thought couldn't possibly fall apart had basically fallen apart. As I recall the game plan, though, so Belichick didn't care about much except for one thing in that game. Randy Moss was not going to beat him. And I remember the game plan was the Patriots were going to roll safety help to Moss's side at every turn and basically eliminate him. And they did. And we talked about it in the episode about Brett. That's the game where Brett got the cut on the chin and I think had to come out for a brief time or a time.
He got carted off like he was shot in the front of Casino.
He was bleeding profusely from his chin and looked like he was going to throw up. But I think the person that ultimately wanted to throw up the most was, in Randy's mind, that was going to be the game that he went back to Foxborough and he showed Brady and he showed Belichick and he showed the Crafts. And Belichick's like, no, you're not going to. And it was that game. That game, as I recall, was just this sort of, we had entered, if this is the correct way to put it, Brian, the 2010 Death March stage. Like, it wasn't completely off the tracks yet, but that game was just, oh boy.
You could smell the rot. It was coming.
Exactly right. That's well put.
Because what happened when, you mentioned Moss's work ethic, which came under question in New England. We were lucky enough to have Chad Greenway come on and talk to us for a while about this season in its entirety, which you folks will be able to see Judd and I's interview with him at the back end of this podcast. But he brought up an interesting point too, which was the very first practice in the Winter Park Fieldhouse. Randy Moss comes out there, and a lot of the guys were like, well, let's take a look at this future Hall of Famer and see him in action. Chad Greenway grew up in South Dakota. He kind of worshiped the Vikings and certainly was a fan of Randy Moss. And he could tell from the first few reps, this guy was mailing it in. And that kind of attitude and that sense of with Moss of mailing it in only intensified as the weeks went by. And as you mentioned too, Belichick obviously had a game plan to prevent him from doing anything, certainly downfield. The Vikings in that game actually played fairly well offensively. They outgained and outpossessed New England, but couldn't punch it through. They made a couple of decisions. Childress decided to go for a touchdown on 4th and goal early in the game as opposed to a field goal or just before the half. And at the end of the game, as legend has it, Randy Moss comes into the locker room, sees Mark and Ziggy Wilf standing right there and says, you all got to get yourself another coach because this ain't working. And sure enough, we're all in the locker room again. He hasn't talked publicly since 3 weeks earlier, post-game in New York. The NFL had fined him, I think, $25,000 for refusing to cooperate with the media. Yep. So we kind of gathered around his locker wondering, all right, what's Randy going to say about his return to Foxborough? And he goes, you don't need to talk to me here. I'm going to the podium. So, wow, this is going to be interesting. So we get down to the podium. Everybody takes a seat. Here comes Randy Moss in a black fitted Boston Red Sox hat, the microphone, says, I'm not going to take any questions because you all find me. I'm going to have my own press conference, and here I go.
From now on, I'm
Five-minute
gonna have to
monologue,
answer more questions.
a beautiful 5-minute monologue in which you would have thought he was giving his induction speech into the Patriots Hall of Fame. How great Coach Bill Belichick was, how much of a brother Tom Brady was, how much he loved everybody in Foxborough, wished them all well, didn't say anything about the Vikings, anything about his performance, or take a single question, and march back off to the bus. And within 24 hours, he was no longer a Minnesota Viking.
Yeah, so he was, and I think the story that I've heard from that post game too was, I think it was it you and Chip Scoggins? It was Chip Scoggins, someone from the Pioneer Press, and a few people waiting for Moss, as he ordinarily did when he talked, to talk at his locker,
right,
or being on guard in case he did talk. And yeah, Moss. So it was the Star Tribune, the Pioneer Press, and probably AP, and a couple of national folks were standing there. And Moss starts to put his jeans on and said, "Y'all don't need to watch a grown man get dressed.
Right.
I'm going to the podium." And I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Jeff Anderson from the Vikings PR department said he just shook his head and said, "Oh my God," because they knew this was going to be a disaster. Like they knew. And Moss then comes through the door. And I remember, I think Childress had talked, and I want to say Favre had talked. And so at that point in time, those of us who were in the main press conference room for the Vikings that day, we're going to go back into the locker room to talk to players who were still stragglers. And I remember it was a side door, small room. And I think it was a long room, but small. And Moss comes shuffling in with a purpose. And I just thought to myself, okay, now it's on. Because there's no way that this guy, of all people, was going to give a podium presser after a bad game for him. And then you're right. He announced that he had been fined. He announced that from now on, if he talked, it was going to be Randy asking the questions and answering his own questions. And then he gave the Patriots soliloquy of everyone here was the greatest. But to back up too, so that week had been the week of the caterer on Friday, right? Where
I was going to get into that too. Yes.
Right. So they got done with practice, and every Friday at that time, the players had picked a local catering service to deliver food to the locker room. And at this point in time, it was Tanucci's, correct?
Tanucci's, yes.
Tanucci's, which is very good food. So they get done with practice, which I believe was an outdoor practice. They get into the locker room, and right before we're allowed access, Moss walks in. I don't know if he tried the food. I think he just looked at the food, and that was the line, "I wouldn't feed this to my dogs." And he basically MF'd the food and the caterers, I think.
Yeah. So what it was, this is Friday, October 29th. As you said, every Friday, a local caterer would bring in food for the guys to eat after their final practice. This was Tanucci's, which is a well-known barbecue place, I think out of Newport, maybe even St. Paul.
Fantastic.
It should be noted, too, that one of the Tanucci's at that time in 2010 was the press secretary for then governor-elect Mark Dayton, Catherine Tanucci, Katie Tanucci, who's well-known in political circles. So she's the incoming press secretary for the governor. The governor and the legislature you are lobbying to get a new stadium deal for. And
I don't remember this part.
Your malcontent receiver comes in on Friday, takes one look at the free spread, by the way, at a guy with a white hat, a carving station for brisket or roast beef, barbecue chicken wings, rice, potatoes, salad, all the fixins. He took one look at it and he goes, "I wouldn't feed this bleep to my dog," and wanders off into the showers. Poor guy standing there with a knife in his hand. This story, of course, eventually leaks out after Randy was cut. I think shooter Charlie Walters might have had it, but it eventually came out that following week. And it's like, is there anything this guy didn't try to do to get fired?
I didn't think about that stadium tie-in. That's a great one, Murph.
Well, the timing of it too.
I didn't know that.
You get a deal done, and
Oh, that's great.
players pissing on the free buffet.
Well, and those caterers were really, really, and they should have been proud people. Well, like this was a thrill. Like you're in the locker room catering food to a professional football team, and that was an honor. It was really cool. And so for this guy to come in and basically, call it bleep when that was completely untrue, was embarrassing. I think a lot of players were just embarrassed and apologized.
They were. A couple of the stories said a couple of anonymous guys told him to shut up and sit down. A couple went over to apologize to the caterer and say, hey, we appreciate everything here. Don't worry about him. He's just Randy being Randy.
So that happens on Friday.
Yes.
The press conference happens on Sunday.
Sunday night after it was a 4:00 game.
They fly home and then
Monday. So everybody's coming back Monday. Brad Childress has his, noon or 1:00 availability, and things are tense. Everybody knows it's tense. And he must have answered 10 or 12 questions about Moss, about his press conference, about what he meant by that. And to Bob Sansevier's credit, Pioneer Press columnist,
yes,
very end, he questioned Brad because some of the tone, I think Brad had mentioned Moss in past tense.
Yep.
So Bob goes, did you just cut him? And Childress said, no, I think he said, no, he stayed back in New England to hang out with family, which was a sidestep.
That's what it was. Yes, you're right.
Question, but he had already made the decision and had already cut him. And not only that, when the locker room opened in a half hour, the players knew that he was cut. And poor Ben Lieber. I always remember Ben Lieber and Jamarcus Sanford, the only two guys that wandered into the room that day. All of a sudden, the Moss news is broken nationally. Childress has already had his availability, basically sidestepped every Moss question he could have, but we can't ask him now that the news has been confirmed. So we have to ask Ben Lieber and Jamarcus Sanford, hey, how about Randy Moss getting cut? Again, another communication and credibility gap to which Childress really never recovered, and set off another chain of events. It comes to find out Childress didn't notify ownership. He didn't notify Rick Spielman. He barely notified the team. He didn't notify the public, or he certainly wasn't truthful with the public when he could have been. He did everything his way, and then it became a 2 or 3 day story as opposed to a 1 day story.
So Brad did his press conference, and you're right. Bob had asked, did you cut him? And Brad said no. So then the timeline is we go back to our media room, which was across the street at the time in Eden Prairie. And the locker room access started, I think approximately half hour or so after Brad had talked.
Right.
So we're cooling our jets in the media room. And as I recall, NFL Network, I think, was the first to report that indeed that they had gotten a tip that Moss had been waived or let go by the Vikings. And so now we're all like, okay, because you could you knew something was weird. I didn't know that. And so now it's out, at least from a credible report, that Moss has been let go. And then to your point, we go back across the street to the locker room at Winter Park. And I remember Ben was distributing, I want to say, Players Association flyers onto the stools for the next practice day, which was going to be on Wednesday. And we pulled him aside and just basically said, you got to tell us, did Moss get cut? And he said, yes, he did. Brad told us. In fact, and Brad had met with the players before he had met with us. So I believe that he has said he cut him, told the players he's gone, told the players don't say a word, lied to us. And then I've been told in hindsight, or in retrospect, I should say, Murph, after that Brad was furious that Lieber didn't cover for him. And I don't know if Brad thought he was going to call the Wilfs and try and explain this. Like, you can't reobtain Randy Moss and cut him and not be in trouble. But that Ben actually got chewed out then because Childress was furious that Ben had confirmed basically that Brad was lying. The other thing, though, that's important is it was reported, I think, but it's been speculated on quite a bit that the meltdown in the Winter Park locker room about the catering got Moss cut. Brad didn't care one bit. What got him cut was what you said, which is being, I think he and Fahu Tahi in Foxborough were the first two players after the Patriots lost into the locker room. And when he looked at the Wilfs, and just as importantly, the Wilfs' friends, because the Wilfs take great pride in bringing their friends post-game, win or lose, into the locker room, when he looked at them and said, y'all better get yourself a new bleeping coach because this guy don't know what he's bleeping doing. That's when that got back to Brad. That's when Brad decided, I'm going to cut him. So the catering thing, while despicable, was not what got Moss jettisoned. What got him cut was basically embarrassing Childress to the owners.
And what I think undercut Childress so many times was his control freak mentality, which was, I'm going to handle this. I'm going to handle it in my way. I'm going to try to contain it. And in doing so, he created 4 or 5 other problems, which was he lost credibility with the media, which isn't a huge deal generally, but he had also done this back in August when they flew the 3 guys down to Mississippi to fetch Moss when Hutchinson and Jared Allen and Ryan Longwell were gone, and he sent his assistant coaches out to the podium to essentially lie, deflect, obfuscate. And we didn't have, we weren't going to have that. We pinned him down like it was a Watergate press conference. What did the president know and when did he know it? And it became obvious these 3 guys, which the whole world already knew because of national leaks, that they were on a plane coming back from Hattiesburg. But instead of being a leader, he sends his underlings out to do the dirty work, and they either fumble it or they don't want to do it, and they're not going to carry his water, which Ben Lieber wasn't going to do because he was a stand-up guy. So he loses credibility with the media. He loses credibility with the public. He loses credibility with his players. He loses credibility with his ownership because he decided not to tell them about this unilateral decision that they may want to know before finding it out publicly. And you could tell from that day on, Brad Childress was a dead man walking. Unless they were somehow to rip off 10 straight wins, which wasn't going to happen, Brad Childress's days were numbered. And what we're going to pivot now into the Childress watch. Moss was here for 28 days. Brad barely made it 20 more days beyond that Moss cutting before his demise came the day after a 31-3 loss, I guess, at the Metrodome. I'm looking here. They ended up beating, bear with me here. They ended up beating Arizona in overtime at home.
Yes.
Then went to Chicago and lost 27-13 on November 14th. So now you're into week 11.
Yep.
They are 3-6 with a home game against the Green Bay Packers.
Yep.
There was a sense that he was coaching for his job, and their performance that day was probably the worst of the season in terms of they weren't in the game. The crowd was surly. Childress was clearly losing his grip, and I distinctly remember Ray Edwards and Chris Cook getting into a fight on the sidelines after some play that was made or some play Chris Cook didn't make, which was par for the course for him back in the secondary.
That was the story of Chris Cook, yes.
And they were chanting "Fire Childress" at the Metrodome. I mean, I'm surprised he made it to the podium post-game on Sunday, but by Monday morning, the inevitable happened, and Brad Childress was no longer the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings.
Randy Moss, though, man, what a 28 days. What a 28 days that was. That was, again, I will flat out say this. You will never see a more destructive path of an athlete in such a short time as what Moss did. And the last thing, too, is, and Chad touches on this as well, don't discount the impact in a negative fashion that he had on Percy Harvin, who had come here a marvelous talent, a little bit troubled. I mean, he was not perfect, but a huge talent, huge upside, had fallen to what, because of character concerns, the 22nd pick, I believe, in the 2009 draft, where he proved to be an absolute steal, at least Murph, for his rookie season. And Harvin worshiped the ground on which Moss walked, and Randy could do no wrong. And I want to say that it was so bad that when Moss got let go, not only did Harvin get more and more distraught and PO'd, but he actually went to Moss's apartment and helped him move out. Like, that's how tight. So Moss, created a ton of destruction. The talent was gone. But very importantly, too, he also helped probably expedite the departure of a guy who, ideally is here for 5-6 years playing well in Percy. I really think that as far as Percy goes, Brian, that was the first domino to fall in his fairly quickly after that decline and then ouster as a Viking.
Yeah, the poison seeped in pretty deep after that.
Really bad.
I'll just ask both of you, and then we can cut this topic off. Judd in particular, but I'd be curious, Declan, what you have to say about this too. Now, we're 10 years removed from this, obviously. Randy Moss's legacy as a Minnesota Viking, what percentage does 2010 play into that? And the farther away we get from it, I mean, he has to own some of his behavior. No question about that. But it's the impact that he had on this market from 98 to 2004. Does any of that get diminished because of the failed experiment of 2010?
In my opinion, absolutely not, because when he got here, he helped change, I think, how the sport operates as far as offensively, as far as the passing game. He took the Viking. So the last regular season home game in 1997 at the Metrodome, Brian, was against the Colts. It was and will be the last game to be blacked out in this market. Moss's arrival, to me, and I think I'm right here, created a new Viking fan. It became a younger, hipper, drunker crowd. But the Vikings, Moss single-handedly, I think, made the Vikings fashionable. And that fan base now is aging, so it's not young now. But,
still drinking, though, I bet.
Basically, absolutely. But I really think that the fan base that was the hardcore Viking fan through 97 was still largely, or at least partially, the Met Stadium old school crowd. And the Vikings games were sort of I remember them by that point being sort of just drab. I mean, they were sold out for the most part, and they did fine, but they weren't this hip, high-flying, high-wire act that they became with Moss. 2000, if Randy had come in and had been and was the primary story, so if everything else was clicking and Randy came in and submarine 2010, I think that's a discussion. But it was it was going so bad, and to what we talked about here, he lasted 28 days. So I really think it's unfair in the big picture to hold Moss too accountable for a really, really bad 1 month stretch when from 98 to 2004. And I'm not saying that this guy didn't have his faults, because he did. I mean, I play when I want to play. His quote to Sid is him. Like, that was 100. There's no BS there. To his last day, Randy decided how he was going to play and when. But that being said, his first stint with the Vikings, he was such a marvelous talent. And personally, to this day, I still don't really like him. But I'll say this for him. It is an absolute crime that 84 is not retired. You can't change the game, not the Vikings, as much as Moss did, and not have your jersey number retired. So I do not, while it's fun to talk about, and while it was certainly a 28-day disaster as far as football goes, I don't, Dex, hold a lot against him, because I take into account his first stint, which had so much brilliance here.
Yeah, I don't hold, it doesn't affect his legacy of what he did in his first tenure with the Vikings. I think it's a part of his legacy, and it's obviously a part of the equation and part of the hilarious just month of disaster that we can talk about with it. But I don't think it affects what he did from 98 to 04, and then even what he did with the Patriots too after he left. I think he, like Judd kind of hit it all in the head there. He changed the entire wide receiver position. Do you want to make a case that Jerry Rice is the greatest wide receiver of all time? Sure. Do you want to make a case someone else is? Absolutely. But in terms of the impact of changing a position and changing the game, I don't know if we can ever see a player who's going to be able to do that again. Like Justin Jefferson's off to this great start for the Vikings, and he's been a phenomenal rookie, and he might break records. But he's not changing the position. Like he's a freak athlete, and he's really, really good at football. Randy Moss changed the complete complexion of how to play wide receiver in the NFL. And in terms of the impact, I would always say that in terms of my lifetime, because I was born in 92, the two guys, if you were talking about who would be like on a Mount Rushmore of the most impactful athletes from my generation, I think it's Moss and Kevin Garnett. And then the remaining two that you put on that Mount Rushmore is completely up to interpretation and whoever you want to put on there. But Moss and KG for those formidable years from my youth, I mean, just in terms of impact and tenacity and the way fans galvanize towards them, it's not even close. No one else holds a candle.
Well, if you want to talk about his lasting impact too, you only have to have a conversation with my soon-to-be 10-year-old son, Ethan, who never saw Randy Moss play, has heard about Randy Moss. But I heard him about a week or two ago singing this jingle that he had gotten off of YouTube, "Pull your 84 jerseys back out." And I'm like, Where did you hear that from? He showed me the video, and there's this 4-minute video of Randy Moss highlights. But I think it's called One Clap or whatever, but it starts off, the very first line in that is "Pull your 84 jerseys out." My son knows the impact of Randy Moss. He hasn't seen him play. He may not even liked him. He may have loved him, but he knows who Randy Moss is because of that. And I think that speaks as much as anything to the impact that he had both as a receiver and as a superstar, but also as a major pro athlete and celebrity in this market that, 22 years after he made his debut, a kid that never saw him play can hum his jersey number.
Ethan found the good from 2010. Congratulations, Ethan. You found the, you know what? I never thought of that, but if Moss does not get traded back here, that doesn't become the lead to the jingle, right?
That does not become a meme. That quote.
Your son found the positive to 2010 Moss's return.
Well, that's a great way to end it on this note. We'll go back. We have one more episode to tackle. We'll talk more about Brad Childress's demise, how that set up Leslie Frazier for a job he wanted all his life, but couldn't imagine the challenges that lay ahead, specifically with Old Man Winter, a decrepit Metrodome, another game in Detroit, and 4 days in Philadelphia that nobody wanted to be there for. So for Judd Zulgad and Declan Goff, this is Brian Murphy. Tune in next time to Tales from 2010, a Viking season like no other.